So the pressure is mounting for the United States to send cluster munitions to Ukraine, which is an emotional subject, and more on that in a second. But there's a reason why Ukraine is asking for these, and a reason why both sides have already used cluster munitions in this war. Is that they're pretty effective on a conventional battlefield. Now, at a high level, a cluster munition is any sort of weapon that releases or ejects submunitions or smaller bomblets. So think of a cluster munition as something designed to target an area, maybe 500 feet by 1,500 feet, a stretch of road, a major intersection, whereas a single artillery round or a single unitary warhead on a rocket is taking out one point on the map. There's one target for that. A cluster munition might have multiple targets. Now, there's a couple different types of cluster munitions. What I'm really going to focus on here, because these are the most likely to be sent from the U.S. arsenal, would be anti-personnel, anti-tank, and mine lane. To give you an idea of what cluster munitions are capable of, we're going to take a look at the CBU-105. That's the Cluster Bomb Unit 105. It's a GPS-guided munition in the U.S. arsenal. So after this bomb is dropped, the CBU-105, it splits off into 10 submunitions. Those fall under parachute. And from each one of those 10, 4 additional submunitions are released. These are like hockey puck shaped. They spin around looking for targets on the ground. That would be vehicles, armored personnel carriers, or tanks. When one is identified, it fires a shape charge directly down into the, usually lightly armored top portion of that vehicle. Now, the submunitions here are designed to either detonate at 50 feet if they haven't found a target, or once they fall to the ground, self-destruct. But that's one of the problems we're going to get into here in a minute. So the CBU-105 is on the pretty advanced side. On the less technologically advanced side, there are cluster munitions that essentially just sling a bunch of explosives in a general area. So you can see how that could be effective in a place that has a lot of trenches, right? One artillery round might hit on the outside and cause no damage to anybody inside the trench. But if you detonate a cluster munition over a trench system, 100 plus submunitions falling from the sky are probably going to make their way into the actual trench. We'll walk through a couple examples here as to how cluster munitions could be used effectively on the battlefields of Ukraine. We're going to start with Bakhmut. And in this scenario, if Russia's trying to cut off Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, which appears to be the case right now, you could see an argument for using cluster munitions to lay minefields over some of the western approaches to the city. A lot of talk as of late has been Russian forces focusing on cutting off those avenues of approach into Bakhmut by getting into ATGM range or even taking the roads with boots on ground themselves. But if they're unable to do that, you can see a scenario where, covering a 50, 100, 500 meter stretch of that road with anti-tank mines, anti-vehicle mines, anti-personnel mines could severely hamper the Ukrainian ability to keep their troops in Bakhmut reinforced. Now, this isn't just slinging mines off into the distance, hoping somebody hits them at some point. You'd expect that Russian forces, based off their current positions in and around Bakhmut, have some sort of oversight of the approaches into the city. So even if Ukraine has to slow down and put, mine clearing equipment in front of their patrols and spend a few hours each day making sure those roads are clear, it significantly hampers what they can do to keep the fight going in the city. Then from the Ukrainian side, let's tie these cluster munitions into the counteroffensive and show how they could be used there. So let's shift down near Kherson, an area where I don't think anyone is expecting a Ukrainian counteroffensive to kick off. They're going to start this big thing with an amphibious crossing. Just prior to doing that, they could isolate an area of the Russian forces by laying mines at a handful of intersections to the rear of the Russian positions. It wouldn't be permanent, it would be somewhat temporary, but it could at least slow down the possibility of Russian reinforcements, allowing Ukraine to establish a bridgehead, get equipment across, and start to push further into Russian-held territory. The point against cluster munitions tends to be either legal or moral, and honestly, both have pretty good arguments. So looking at the legal side first, and this is where, when I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is kind of an emotional subject, this is what we're getting into here. So the Convention on Cluster Munitions went into effect in August of 2010, but not a lot of countries signed it. So the convention said that any nation that ratifies this convention would not use cluster munitions, transfer, produce, stockpile, anything that has to do with cluster munitions. Pretty clear cut, makes sense. A bit of a problem here. The United States did not sign, neither did Ukraine, and neither did Russia. So this is one of those nice, confusing cases of international law where this law sits out there, but then how does it apply to three nations that did not ratify or in any way, shape, or form agree to this law being put in the books? So I understand that there very well may be a legal argument to the United States can't transfer these weapons to Ukraine, and Ukraine cannot use these weapons on the battlefield. Personal opinion, I don't think the legal argument is going to gain much momentum here in terms of the transfer or eventual use of cluster munitions. I mean, they've already been used in this conflict by both sides, and in the last 10 years, they've been used in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, in Syria, Sudan, Yemen, and Ethiopia. So why now? Why in this case is the ICC or the UN going to bend over backwards to, really come after one of the parties? Then you have the moral argument, which I think is incredibly valid, but a challenge because you have to balance it with the needs on the battlefield today. The moral argument generally has to do with the fact that these cluster munitions have a high dud rate. So we talked earlier about how the CBU-105, if it doesn't find a target, it detonates or it self-destructs when it hits the ground. Maybe. Not all of them do that, and there's so many different factors involved. First off, there's a lot of submunitions that do not have a self-destruct mechanism, which means that there's an explosive charge sitting somewhere on the ground, scattered all over the place, and in all likelihood, it's going to be an innocent civilian or even a child that stumbles across that years or even decades after the conflict is over. This has been a constant reminder all around the world. There are still children today being killed from U.S.-dropped cluster munitions in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and there are still kids today being killed in Afghanistan from Soviet-dropped cluster munitions in that country. And to be clear, there's no modern technology that has perfectly solved that problem. There are always going to be duds. There's always going to be misfires. And if you look at, the examples we pulled up here, say the Russian use in and around Bakhmut, if they were to fire on one of these roads to the west, that cluster munition very well might fall on a paved road, an agricultural field, somebody's garden, in a tree, in a wetlands. Like, every one of those has a serious impact on whether or not that round detonates, whether it is found tomorrow and disabled, or whether it sticks around for the next 17 years and is found by a child who isn't even born yet. So cluster munitions can be very, very effective on the battlefield, but there's a pretty clear downside. And in my opinion, the biggest downside isn't felt in the next few days, weeks, or months, but by generations down the line from people living in that country. And Ukraine fully understands that risk. So if they look at this weapon system and decide that that is necessary to continue or carry on the fight, maybe we should send them. What do you think? That's all I got for now. We'll see y'all next time.